and thanks for joining us today. My name is Leslie Dach, and I'm the co-chair of the Defend Democracy Project. I'm joined today by Celinda Lake, who I know many of you know, who has polled extensively around the January 6th issues and has new survey data to share with you today. Celinda, as you know, is one of America's premier pollsters, an expert on public opinion, particularly on this subject, and was one of the two main pollsters for the Biden campaign. Also joined by Norm Eisen, who, again, I'm sure all of you must know, a globally recognized authority on law, ethics, and anti-corruption. I hope everyone has had a chance or will look at his New York Times op-ed piece today. Norm served as special counsel to the House Judiciary Committee for the Trump impeachment from February 2019 through February 2020. He also served in the Obama administration, both as ambassador to the Czech Republic and to special counsel to the President for Ethics and Government Reform. We meet just 2 days after the historic testimony by Cassidy Hutchinson that fully revealed the depths and breadth of the criminal conspiracy engineered by President Trump and a large number of his allies in the Republican Party and in Congress to foment a violent attack on our country on January 6th and to overthrow an election he clearly knew he lost by means that he clearly knew were illegal. When these hearings began, many people wondered if America would pay attention, if they'd have any impact, and whether the American people would be moved to action. We know now, and Celinda will talk about, how these hearings have had tremendous impact, an impact that continues to grow hearing by hearing. Vast majorities of the American people are paying attention, and they are deeply concerned by what they see, read, and hear. They believe that a crime has been committed. They want accountability in the courts and at the ballot box. And they hold not just President Trump responsible, but they hold him and his allies in the Republican Party responsible for what's happened. We know that the president knew that his actions were illegal. He knew that people were arriving with guns, assault rifles into an event that he encouraged them to march to the Capitol, and that he fully understood would become violent. So now let me turn it over to Celinda, who will walk through what we now know about the public's growing reaction to these hearings. Thanks, Celinda.
Thank you, Leslie. And I want to thank so much the Research Consortium for sponsoring a lot of data and focus groups, and we'll share both with you. Some of this as recently as just last night in focus groups with swing voters. I also want to thank Norm for his voice of conscience in all of this. And I want to thank all of the people at the consortium for their hard work and all of the people on our staff for their hard work. So this is very, very exciting data, and it tells a very clear story that is changing and getting stronger as we speak. Let's look at the slides, and we'll show you the first one. As Leslie said in his introduction, Americans are hearing about the investigation. They are following the investigation. If we look at the next slide here, and I'll just get it. There we go. So you see here, 81%. Next slide. Thank you. 81% of the public has heard about the January 6th congressional investigation, and that includes 72% of independents. Independents right now are paying the least attention of any voters, but they are paying attention to the January 6th congressional hearings. If we look at the next slide, you'll see that support for the hearings has increased over time. And this is comparing May data to June data. And even in that short time period of the initial hearings, you saw a 12-point increase in support among, if we turn to the previous slide, a 12-point increase in support among Democrats, a whopping 20-point increase among independents, which I can't tell you how startling that data is, and 73% of independents supporting this investigation, and even a third of Republicans supporting the investigation. One of the more interesting questions is, if we look at the next slide, is to compare these hearings to other events. And so this is data comparing it to the January 6th to the second impeachment. And you can see that there's even greater support for the congressional investigation than there was for the second impeachment. That is very dramatic with independents and with Republicans. And again, we consistently see a third of Republicans supporting the hearings, supporting prosecution, supporting accountability, and supporting taking this to the ballot box. If we look at the next slide, we see as we look underneath that people think the committee is doing important work to uncover the truth. 52% of Americans. For Democrats, it's basically a universal value, 80%. But even for independents, by 2-to-1, 45%, a strong plurality say it is important work to uncover the truth here in the investigations. If we look at the next slide, we see that a majority of voters think Trump Republicans' efforts to contest the 2022 election were an attempt to claim and hold power and overturn the will of the people. And what is emerging very, very strongly from the hearings is not just that Trump was responsible, but there was a faction of the Republicans, Trump Republicans, who were responsible as well. And that this was about overturning the will of the people, overturning the elections. And people take that very, very seriously. Again, a solid majority of independents by 19 points think that this was an attempt to claim power and overturn the will of the people. If we look at the next slide, there is some very interesting research that the consortium has conducted looking at media tests and looking at tests of visuals and the different parts of the testimony. And here are some of the, we haven't had a chance to look at Cassidy's testimony, but you can see here some of the really strong elements. Officer Edwards, footage of the violence, Vice Chair Cheney asserting that Trump rejected advice that his actions were illegal, Pence counsel Greg Jacob, and Republicans and independents responding very, very strongly to the threats to Pence and the statements by the Pence people, and statements that clearly show that Trump's lies and that he was lying, also very, very convincing. If we look at the focus groups and what the qualitative research has shown in the next slide, here are two quotes, one from an uncommitted voter, one from a new midterm voter, people who voted in 2018, but did not have history of traditionally voting in midterm elections, a very important constituency in the 2022 elections. As the uncommitted state voters said, what they have stated is factual, honest, and true. And I believe all of this honesty is coming out properly through the committee, and we're trying to restore American pride in our system. The new midterm voters saying, I know that's what has taken so long. So that's been doing a really thorough investigation and interviewing all these people behind closed doors for a year and a half. So people think the investigation has been thorough, it's been factual, and it's lifted up a very important, coherent narrative for people. If we look at the next slide, people say overwhelmingly, they are less likely to vote for a member of Congress who supported the people who attacked our Capitol on January 6th. 63% now say they would be less likely to vote for that person. It has increased, particularly among Democrats and independents. And this is an issue that affects both the base and the surge, the people that need to turn out to vote in the 2022 elections, and the swing voters. Note, 71% of independents say they are less likely to vote for a member of Congress who supported the attacks on the Capitol. And that is a 12-point increase over the course of the hearings. Again, a third of Republicans, 36%, say I'm less likely to vote for a member. Only 10% of Republicans say I am more likely to vote for a member who supported the people who attacked the Capitol. People express this in focus groups as well. This has become increasingly, even with everything that's going on. If we look at the next slide, a voting issue, and again, an uncommitted voter and a new midterm voter, if they keep doing it, they're going to succeed. And we will no longer be a representative government anymore, because they're just going to continue to tweak their maps and gerrymander and do all the things they can do to keep themselves in power. And then we won't have a vote anymore. People don't think this is the end. People think this is the beginning. And one of the reasons they feel so strongly about accountability is they think it must be prevented in the future. Yes, I would definitely not vote for a candidate who lied about 2020. All politicians lie, but this claim is over the top and it seriously damages the country. People see this as an attack on the country, as an attack on our fundamental right to vote. Accountability, if we look at the next slide, is the number one thing that people want, even ahead of justice. And accountability means holding people responsible, punishing people, and having them pay the price for the deeds they did. If we look at the next slide, we can see that people are holding both Donald Trump responsible, but also increasingly Trump Republicans. And we're seeing in the most recent focus groups, people making this connection that there was planning beforehand, there were actions afterwards. It wasn't just spontaneous. It wasn't one person. And they're increasingly connecting this responsibility to Trump Republicans in Congress and to their votes at state, local, and national office. If we look at the next slide, people believe overwhelmingly in accountability, both in Washington and at the voting booth. So they want criminal penalties, and 73% of people say this was a crime, and they want to take this to the ballot box. Again, Democrats universally, but look at those independent numbers. 71% of independents say, I want criminal penalties for those found guilty, and 74% say, I'm going to vote against the people when I get a chance in these elections. And again, look at those Republicans. 39 and 38% of Republicans say criminal penalties and hold accountable at the ballot box. Again, people equally eloquent, if we look at the next slide, in their comments out of the focus groups. You should never be allowed to hold public office ever again, not any single one of them, losing every privilege that they would have ever received had they retired or stopped. I think they should be removed. I'd like to add a public apology because that was something that was done and it offended the entire country. Everybody was affected by that, impacted by that. A public apology along with removal. People are very, very strong in terms of what they consider accountability here. If we look at the next slide, we can see two of the quantifications of this accountability. So 2/3 again saying they would not vote for anyone who played a role in January 6th, including 73% of independents and 39% of Republicans. And note there is real intensity to this issue. And finally, when we look at a wide range of accountability measures in the next slide, we see overwhelming support across the board. Public record, bar them from running for office, remove them now, kick them out of Congress, strip them of their pensions and their benefits for life, prosecute them for committing a crime. And even among Republicans, only 35% of Republicans say we should not punish the people who were supported or encouraged the attacks. Accountability is the watchword here. 82% of Americans want accountability. If we look at the next slide, accountability is by far the strongest message. And I'll leave you with the language of accountability here. Very, very, on the next slide, very, very strong language here that people are responding to. We must investigate and hold accountable the politicians who aided and supported the attacks, promoted violence with lies about the election, and promised to illegally overturn the election results. We must investigate and prosecute the politicians behind this criminal conspiracy, and people increasingly see it, thanks to the hearings, as a whole conspiracy, not just a couple of criminal acts, to ensure justice and that in our country can move forward from the harmful stain of January 6th attacks. In sum, people have heard about the hearings. They're very concerned about the Trump Republicans, not just Trump. There is an evolving narrative. People see it as a crime, but they also see it as a criminal conspiracy. They demand accountability, and they're very serious about what they consider accountability. And we are seeing these numbers increase quite dramatically over the course of the hearing, including with independents who traditionally don't pay very much attention. So Leslie, let me turn it back to you.
Thank you, Celinda. It's usually compelling data, and I hope for everyone who's been listening to it, that it lays to rest any questions people had or any skepticism people had about whether these hearings would matter, whether the American people would pay attention, whether the American people would be concerned and upset, because we know now that they are. They're paying attention, they're very upset, they want consequences, and that those numbers continue to grow. And if anything, Celinda's presentation probably undervalues what's really happening, because most of this data didn't capture the impact of the last hearing and some of the earlier hearings. So if anything, as we all know who watched, that these hearings become more compelling each time. And there's no doubt that the American public reacted even more negatively to what they heard and saw just 2 days ago. I want to now quickly show a handful of slides from a poll that the Defend Democracy Project just completed over the last 2 days in Pennsylvania as an indicator state for how people feel where these issues indeed are on the ballot, given, as we know, the nomination of a Trump co-conspirator in the gubernatorial race in Pennsylvania. And all the full poll will be sent to everybody on this call. Basically, Pennsylvanians are paying attention. 78% of voters said they had seen, heard, or read a lot or some about the hearing, including nearly 50% who say they've heard a lot. And this includes 78% of independents and 63% of Republicans and 62% of Trump voters. So people are paying attention. Next slide. I think it's quite important what is on this slide, that a majority of voters now believe that the problem is not just with Donald Trump, but the problem is because of Donald Trump and members of the Republican Party who were loyal to him. So when people are given a choice of saying that the problem is Trump's problem alone, or the problem was a problem of Trump and his loyalists, you can see the dramatic number that say that the problem is Trump and those members of the Republican Party who follow him. And those numbers are equally as strong with independents. And now for the last slide. Here are just some other quick findings which demonstrate across the board the majority concern that people have about the things that have been revealed during these hearings. 64% concerned about his lying about voter fraud. 62% concerned about him raising money off the big lie. 68% concerned by Trump demanding that Pence overturn the election. And 61% concerned over MAGA threats against local officials and over GOP members of Congress seeking pardons. Once again, just from the last 2 days, in a state in which very important elections are going to be happening in the fall. And with that, let me turn it now over to Norm, who has been following very closely and been one of the main architects of everyone's thinking about the role that a criminal conspiracy has played in these events. Thanks, Norm.
Thanks, Leslie. Celinda, always good to be with you, and appreciated that incisive summary of the data. And I'm going to talk about some of the reasons why we're seeing these really extraordinary movements in public opinion and the sentiments of the American people. And my law firm colleague, Madison, is going to put some links in the chat as we go to analysis that I've done along the way. At the outset of the hearings, I wrote for the Times that to measure success for the committee, we would need to look at 3 dimensions, 3 boxes, if you would. And Madison, please drop that Times piece into the chat. The cable box, that is the performance of the committee in reaching out to the American people, conveying the truth of what happened in all of its complexity. The ballot box, and you've just seen some of the data indicating how salient the work of the committee, the investigation and the hearings is, and the jury box, the prospect of a actual prosecutions of those who are responsible, not just for what happened on January 6th, but the long run-up that that we hoped the committee would elucidate. Normally, we would have a fourth box, the tally box on those long legislative sheets, which I know everyone has seen, where you measure votes on legislation in Congress. Just as after Watergate, we had a complete reworking of the legislative system, but owing to the log jams in Congress, the prospect of that kind of comprehensive democracy reform has been frustrated by an intractable GOP minority in the Senate, principally by them. I am going to come back with a footnote about legislation at the very end. First, then, a word about the cable box, and then I'll move to the heart of the matter, the most likely area for accountability, and that is criminal prosecution. I won't bury the lead. I believe that we have gone from, quote, likely crimes, as a federal judge said Trump was involved in before the hearings, to substantial proof, and perhaps proof beyond a reasonable doubt in two areas. And we, after Cassidy Hutchinson's performance on Tuesday, we now are on the precipice. We're reaching the verge of proof beyond a reasonable doubt in a third area, and the hearings are not over. We're in the halftime break. And that means that I assess a high likelihood of state and or federal prosecution of Trump and others as a result of the movement that we've had. First, a word about the committee's performance. Myself, having been counsel for the for a House committee for the impeachment and trial of Donald Trump, I think it has been extraordinary. I wrote in the Times this morning about both the crimes and the performance. Madison, if you'd be kind enough to put up this morning's link, if it's not in the chat already. It's the Watergate hearings, but for the TikTok era. Volumes will be written about what the committee has done and how they have done it. But the blend of, the oldest form, most ancient form of people sitting by the campfire, these live witnesses, and telling you what happened, with these rapid succession video clips that really capture the shorter attention, but more intense attention span of our era vis-a-vis previous hearings, and the fact that the case is being prosecuted, despite promising not to do a criminal case, they are very much articulating one, by Republican witnesses, almost entirely Trump allies and adherents, his most ferocious defenders, until he went one step too far with this conspiracy to overturn the election. That has been compelling. And of course, the role of Liz Cheney as the prosecutor in chief, the single most recurring voice, even more than the chairman, herself an extremely conservative Republican who also cannot made a break with the former president and his co-conspirators when it came to these crimes. What are these crimes and how has the committee substantiated them? And is there an obstacle, the single biggest obstacle we often purportedly hear about, intent? I begin, and perhaps my biggest, the most frequent thing that I talk about and text about and email about with my friends in the press who've really done a good job of covering everything. But if there's one place where I find myself reminding my friends, we have to not only talk about Merrick Garland, we have to always say state and federal prosecution, because there is a very advanced state prosecution of Trump for the principal issues until Cassidy Hutchinson, the principal issues that have been established in these proceedings. They are the Georgia state crimes. Madison, if you'd be kind enough to put in my big report on the Georgia state crimes into the chat, that we heard about in that stunning day when Brad Raffensperger, Gabriel Sterling, both from Georgia, and Rusty Bowers testified, just fined 11,780 votes. There are a set of state and federal crimes, for example, the Georgia prohibition on soliciting election fraud. There are a set of state and federal crimes that are under advanced investigation on the state side in Georgia, and that are thrown off by that. It is not just a Georgia crime. Madison, if you'll put my NBC Think piece in the chat, please, with Fred Wertheimer. It's also a federal crime to fabricate non-existent votes. Anyone, that tape is the first. There are 3 smoking guns in this case. The tape is the first. It's not just smoking guns. There's a smoking arsenal of Donald Trump and his co-conspirators' guilt. The first is that tape of the January 2nd call with Brad Raffensperger. That establishes both state and federal crimes. The second is the fraudulent electoral certificates, also under investigation in Georgia. Also we know, because of the flurry of subpoenas, including the raid on Jeff Clark and also the seizure of John Eastman's devices, both of them intimately involved in the phony elector scheme to fabricate, forge, and counterfeit electoral certificates in 7 states. You look at them, they look just like a regular one. They were submitted to the federal government, to the National Archives. They often were, people went, these phony electors, to the legally appointed location using subterfuge and concealment to sneak in to government buildings to fabricate these certificates. We know that's under federal investigation. We know that's under investigation in Georgia. And those certificates are the smoking gun. And why does that matter? Madison, if you'll put my Washington Post op-ed in the chat. No matter what you may believe about whether you won or lost an election, you do not have the right to fabricate non-existent votes or to forge electoral certificates. It's like OJ. He believed that he owned the memorabilia, and he did appear to own some of the memorabilia in that hotel room he broke into in Las Vegas, but he went to jail because you can't take the law into your own hands. It's electoral vigilantism. And finally, the third set of crimes are federal crimes. I believe 18 U.S.C. 1512, obstruction of an official proceeding in Congress, 18 U.S.C. 371, conspiracy to defraud the United States, the violence that we now know Trump was fully engaged in. He knew those protesters were armed. He wanted to take down the MAGs. He wanted to march with those armed protesters, and he incited them in his speech nonetheless. He said, let's fight. A federal crime is made out by that when you combine it with his spurring them while his own vice president was under assault, with his tweet a little after 2 p.m. on January 6th, and then the callous, not just indifference, but agreement with the violence that we heard Cassidy Hutchinson provide testimony about what Trump had said to Mark Meadows and Pat Cipollone. That, by the way, is one of the reasons it's so important that the committee subpoena Pat Cipollone as they've done and bring him in. So state and federal crimes amply proved in 3 dimensions, multiple smoking guns. And I think that after this week, we are quite likely, I assess, to have criminal prosecution of Trump. I think it also gives momentum, my last note, to fixing some of our broken laws, and perhaps we'll see fixes to the Electoral Count Act that governs January 6th with a plus package, so-called ECA plus, that prevents this kind of violence from ever happening again. We need a big plus package to go with any ECA fix. Thank you very much, Leslie. Back to you.
Thanks, Norm. I think Norm might have been practicing his final speech to the jury. Did a pretty good job.
You can take the trial lawyer out of the courtroom, but you can't take the courtroom out of the trial lawyer.
I've heard. I've watched a lot of TV, so I know. Let me get serious again, which is that today we've really focused on, and the hearings have focused on to date, on what led up to January 6th, the attack on our country on January 6th, and what followed. But it's very important for us all to recognize that this is an ongoing assault on America. We know that the criminal conspiracy continues. We were told last week at the close of the hearings that there are likely incidences of witness tampering and intimidation. We know that many refuse to come and testify, that they're fighting subpoenas, that they refuse to show up because they don't want to tell the truth. And we know that this continues. We also know that Republicans are complicit in their silence. They refuse to stand up against Donald Trump, and that being complicit should also be considered as part of this ongoing criminal conspiracy. You don't need to know more than what Josh Hawley said today or yesterday when he told the press in Missouri that he hasn't watched a single second of these hearings and doesn't intend to. I don't think you need to know any more about Trump and his allies in the Republican Party than that statement. And finally, the ongoing conspiracy to be in a position to overturn elections that they've lost and to deny people their freedom to vote continues in key states around the country as Republicans continue to nominate people who were part of the conspiracy and people who refuse to recognize legitimate elections to run for the highest offices. And today, the Defend Democracy Project has released reports in 7 states, Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Nevada, and Wisconsin, that show the ongoing threat to our freedoms. And you also don't have to look any further than just this Tuesday's primaries, where in states like Colorado and Mississippi, Republicans once again nominated for statewide and federal elections people who have been part of this conspiracy from day one, who are election deniers and refuse to tell the American people the truth about what happened on January 6th and what happened in the 2020 election. They are preparing to overturn elections in the future that they have lost. So thank you all for joining today to listen to the Celinda's data and Norm's analysis. And now we'll turn it over to questions. My colleague, Nicole, will moderate the questions.
Thank you, Leslie. Yeah, if you have a question, please raise your hand. We'll be taking questions from reporters now. You can also feel free to email me at nicole@projectdefenddemocracy.com, and we'll just give folks a second to get their questions in. Okay, it looks like we have one via email. I think this is kind of just for the panel. Why is Hutchinson's testimony that Meadows nearly went to the Roger Stone meeting so important for potential and future criminal prosecution? Norm, I think that's a Norm question.
The reason that the testimony about Meadows' desire to go to the so-called Willard War Room, aptly named because of the war on democracy that was already well underway and then exploded into the violence of January 6th. The reason that is so important is because the more that the committee establishes, as they have very steadily been doing, the connections between those who planned, funded, and executed the events of January 6th, the more these federal cases under 18 U.S.C. 1512 in particular, obstructing the proceeding before Congress, but also under 18 U.S.C. 371, conspiracy to defraud the United States, already found likely. It builds a bridge to the planning and then the execution of the violence on January 6th. So Meadows is clearly, we know he's having contacts with Flynn and Stone. We know Stone is tied into these violent groups. So Meadows is clearly a conduit. So both the fact of that connection and his willingness to engage in the, never mind inappropriate, I mean, Cipollone's warnings about the illegality of what was going on. Even Cassidy Hutchison understood that in warning him not to go. Meadows is the conduit, and I expect we're going to learn much more about his communications in future hearings, not to mention prosecutions, about the ways he worked with the likes of Stone and Flynn, who we know were important, and others in the war room who we know were connected to the either to the militias or to the funding and planning and execution of bringing these violent armed mob members to Washington the very next day after Meadows wanted to go to that war room.
Thank you, Norm. And then another question for the panel. What should we expect to see from the committee in July?
Norm, I don't know if you have any insights into that or whether we just leave that to the committee.
Well, I can speculate. The committee has laid out a 7-point conspiracy. And I think as we move, and they've pretty methodically checked off the parts of that 7-point plan. So I think we can expect to hear about. We've learned, for example, about what went on in the States, about the pressure on Pence, about the pressure on DOJ. So I think we can expect to have the focus pivot back to the militias, the run-up to January 6th. We haven't yet heard about that war room. You know, another way that they've been so good, as I write in the Times this morning, they tease in every hearing. They end the hearing by, with some important nuggets of information. And in this hearing, we did hear, they did point to the war room. So I expect we'll hear more about the run up to January 6th. And then I know we still haven't had the other end of the bookend. What went on January 6th, and how do we bring together the stunning violence and the revelations of the very first primetime committee hearing of how the insurrection looked through the windows of the Capitol with that mysterious 187 minutes. What was going on in the White House? We got pieces of it from Cassidy Hutchison. I'm sure we get more. So those are the final two pieces of the puzzle that in some form I expect to hear about when the committee comes back in July. I would caution everyone, having worked up there on a similar proceeding and, myself having been a trial lawyer for over 3 decades now, I would caution everyone that we don't know what calls came into the committee after the Cassidy Hutchison hearing, but there have been significant developments after each hearing. And the Hutchison hearing wasn't planned. So I think this is a living event, this investigation and these hearings. So I wouldn't get too locked into any set plan. I doubt the committee knows exactly what the schedule, the number of hearings, and the content of the hearings are going to be. But my estimate is that those two, if you just look at Cheney's list from the first day, these are the two boxes that the committee needs to check, kind of going the run up, the planning, the funding, the ties with Trump world, the many Trump people who are involved in all that, and then what happened on the day of from the windows, not the windows of the Capitol, but the windows of the White House.
Thanks, Norm. I think we're at the end of our allotted time. We will be sure that all those covering reporters and journalists on this call receive follow-up materials, both recording and a video of this event, plus links to Norm's op-eds, links to the reports that I announced today, and links to the deck that was presented by Celinda. So once again, thank you for people's time. Thank you to Norm. Thank you to Celinda and to my colleagues at the Defend Democracy Project. Hope everyone has a good day.